Hey everybody, welcome to week 7. I hope that you're all doing well. I know this weather is crazy. It's always good to remember that in October, it's like a roller coaster with weather-wise, and then it always seems like by Halloween or thereabouts, we actually get a nice chill in the air and it feels like it's fall. But to be in the high 90s and low hundreds now, it just feels a little nuts. But, that's the way that it goes. So week 7, we're almost to the halfway point of the class. Congrats. I know that in these videos, I tend to nag a lot. And so I'm not gonna in this video. You know what you need to do. You know what you shouldn't be doing. And we should all be good with that. So last week, you learned about the British invasion with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And the Beatles were really the ones that started the whole British invasion. So again, I'll get people that'll say, well, I don't see why the Beatles were that important and all of this and that. Really, no English bands or artists had made it across the Atlantic, as it were. And so it's really a big deal that the Beatles broke through, because that opened the doors for the British invasion. So you think back to Elvis, and Elvis opened the doors for artists like Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis and folks like that, and then even opened bigger doors for folks like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, and everything. So with the Beatles, you have a similar thing in that, the Rolling Stones, The Who, The Kinks, Herman's Hermits, all these different bands might not have ever had a chance to make it if it wasn't for what the Beatles did. So that started in 1964, and there is always discussion that and it goes back and forth. People talk about, the impact that, the Beatles' timing and the assassination of JFK and just sort of how things were working. I get sometimes students will talk about the impact of Vietnam. Vietnam was happening already, but it wasn't really escalating like it would in the later half of the 60s. But again, if the Beatles hadn't broken these doors open, then there is a possibility that we never would have known. And there's all these amazing occurrences within the career of the Beatles that you've already learned about that had to come into play for them to be able to do it. A significant one in terms of the impact of the Beatles, of course, is them meeting Bob Dylan and Bob Dylan challenging them to write songs with deeper meaning. And we'll learn next week, the Beatles challenging Bob Dylan with, sort of electric music and melodies and things like that. So those are really, really significant. So you have the Beatles that open things up, and they're very much influenced through skiffle, through American rock and roll. You learned about all of that. The Rolling Stones really, really influenced by the blues and rhythm and blues primarily. So they're very, as I said last week, very different bands. And then this week, you're going to learn about some more bands. So there's really 4 big bands that are connected with the British invasion, at least in terms of long-term significance. So you have the Beatles, they're number 1. And then underneath that, so if you picture the Beatles here, and then if you were to go down, you would have the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, and the Who. And they all have different impacts and influences on the music, and so we can take them from there. One of the things that I would often point out in a class, and I'll point out now, is that, with the Beatles, it was interesting because you had 4 musicians, excuse me, 4 musicians, and you had 4 writers. Now, Lennon and McCartney did the majority of it, but George Harrison did some writing, as did a little bit Ringo Starr. When you get into the Rolling Stones, you really had 2 writers. You had Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. You're going to learn about the Kinks, which had 2 writers, Ray and Dave Davies. And then you're going to learn about the Who really had 1 writer. So it was primarily the vehicle for Pete Townsend. You can see Pete Townsend up on there behind me, along with a Bruce book, as I'm working through my library and adding these books into the to the reading list that's down in the miscellaneous section at the end. So first of all, keep in mind that if the Beatles hadn't broke down, we wouldn't know them. And then there were all these other bands that came out through. There was a whole scene called the Mersey Sound. It was influenced by the Beatles. And again, you have Herman's Hermits and folks like that. You have the Kinks and the Who, which were connected to the mod scene. And this is one thing I didn't really talk about last week, but it's more of an issue now, is that you had these two interesting rival scenes in England at the time. You had the mods and you had the rockers. Now, the rockers were those that loved American rock and roll, and they really dressed that way. So they had, Levi's that were cuffed, boots, leather jackets, had that James Dean look about them. And then the mods, which were more into the modern music. The rockers also were into motorcycles. The mods wore suits, skinny ties. They rode Vespas. They were really more into the modern sounds. And for modern back then, you'd be thinking about rhythm and blues, Motown, soul, and the Beach Boys. Those were more influences in the mod bands. And so the Kinks and the Who were very connected, at least early on, to the mod scene. It was kind of short-lived, and they moved on from there. So you're gonna learn about that because it is important, and it creates this really interesting tension and really develops certain scenes, as it were. And so, you're going to learn about that. You're going to learn about, the influence of The Who. One thing we haven't really talked about is this idea of a concept album. And so you started to learn about those either directly or indirectly. So a concept album is an album where there is a story or a theme that that sort of carries through. So in a simple way, a Christmas album would be a concept album, right? Because it's all Christmas songs. There was a Sinatra albums, like Songs in the Wee Hours of the Night, and that was like, this sort of late night, this is what you would listen to. And really one of the first big concept albums in a way was, which you already learned about, is the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. And the Beach Boys really pushed the Beatles. There was a great creative tension between those bands. So there was a tension to keep outdoing each other. So you had the Beach Boys with Pet Sounds, where there was this concept of this course of a relationship. And then that pushed the Beatles to make Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was a concept album just in that it was a bunch of songs that were connected, not so much in terms of story or thematically, but by a fictitious band, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and these songs that they are playing. And then really you get to a very significant concept album with The Who, which is The Who's Tommy, which was really deemed a rock opera, and it was a character, Tommy, that is telling this story about him and his life, and he witnesses a traumatic accident, and he becomes deaf, dumb, and blind, but then he becomes a sort of a savant, if you would call it, I guess, maybe a pinball player, if y'all remember pinball. So it's really fascinating. It's an amazing album. And so you're going to learn about that. And then after that, The Who also had another concept album with Quadrophenia, which, for the record, is one of my favorite albums of all time. And in fact, the other night, me and my family, we were sitting around a fire celebrating my youngest's birthday, who he's 20, so he's not young, he's all your ages. But and so one of the questions that came up, we were just having fun asking weird random questions. And so one of them was, if you could listen to any album again for the first time, what would it be? So we went around the room, and my youngest, he actually said Pet Sounds, which I think is a really great choice, and all of that. But my wife actually knew what I would pick, which was The Who's Quadrophenia. It's still just one of my favorite albums. It just hits on every mark. It is a phenomenal album, and Love Reign O'er Me, which ends it, is like one of the greatest love songs. But the musicianship's super high, the energy's high. It's fantastic. So I think I'll probably put a question in like maybe I'll do two in here. So one was what mine is, which I just told you, and then I'll put it just like maybe a fill in the blank, because I'd love to know what yours is. So that album that you could go back and listen to for the very first time again, maybe it blew your mind, or maybe you didn't even fully get what it was until farther down the line, and then you want to go back maybe and hear it all again, but hear it with fresh ears. So, this is an interesting thing too, is that by the time we get to the mid-60s, the concept of an album becomes very significant. So, the idea that you would listen through. So up until the mid-60s, albums were really just collections of singles. Remember that lesson way back where I showed you the 45. So, groups would come out with singles, they would have, if they could have a hit with it, then eventually if they had enough hits, they'd put it together for an album, at least in the pop and rock world. But by the time you get to Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper's and Tommy and things like that, and there are others as well going on in Velvet Underground and Frank Zappa, then what you have is this idea that it's the idea that you would sit down and listen to an album from beginning to end and follow it through, and that's part of what that book I showed you last week, that how the Beatles destroyed rock and roll, is tied into that. So you're going to learn about that, and then you're going to learn about a little bit more, which is the impact of the blues in England. So there's this thing called the British Blues Revival, which is really a misnomer. It's really the British revival of American blues. So there were a lot of British bands and people that loved American blues. And keep in mind that American blues had really kind of fallen out of popularity. It got replaced by rhythm and blues, and then it got replaced by rock and roll, and then you have soul and you have Motown. And so a lot of people didn't know those early blues artists. People like Robert Johnson, Willie Dixon, Son House, those folks, Howlin' Wolf. And so thanks to British bands and British audiences, they actually helped bring those artists back. The blues might have fallen by the wayside, and they helped bring that back, as well as the British artists bringing back. They were very influenced by American rock and roll, by Elvis, by Carl Perkins, by Buddy Holly and the Crickets. And I don't know if this was in the materials, but the Beatles got their name because they were influenced by Buddy Holly and the Crickets. So the Crickets had the Bug name, and they took the Beatles, although they changed the spelling to Beatles, beat like music beat. So you're going to learn about that, and then you're going to learn about the impact of the British invasion on American music. So you're going to learn about things like garage bands and power pop, and the blues revival here because of the British blues revival. So I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to be asked a question for your discussion on, they say that the British saved American blues and they saved American rock and roll. So I want you to think about the blues and rock and roll in the States, right? So from the 30s through the 50s, think about what happened, how they went away, and then how did British bands save it? I'm going to leave it there, but hopefully I've said enough so that you will all do well. And then give me examples. This is one thing I keep writing about, and I ask it in the questions. Make sure you read through my questions, but I'll ask you, give examples of songs. So when you're talking about, the Rolling Stones or the Who or the Kinks or the Beatles, give me an example of a song that really helps justify your argument or your answer. Even the same thing, when I ask you about current bands and current music, I want to hear about, don't just say, oh, I think Kanye did this. Say, I think Kanye did this, and this song really shows that, or whatever artist it is. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I think that's it for now. Again, y'all know what you need to do. I want to encourage you. Reach out to me. Some of you are reaching out with good questions. Don't forget about your concert report. If you're not sure of if it counts, please message me in Canvas, and I will get back to you and let you know. Include a link if you can. And I think that's it. Keep cool. Have a great week. Happy October. We'll talk soon. Bye.